Okay, so I want to talk about the concept of priority and necessity. Okay. Well, important things and necessary things. Um, so important and here is essential. And it might be surprising the kind of conclusions we come to, and actually a lot of people probably have already sort of discovered these kind of things in their own way. It's kind of funny. It all started with me when I was in primary school. This stupid funny little thing called Happy Harold. I don't know if you've heard of Happy Harold the giraffe. They came to our school in like a little van, and then we went inside and they taught us some lessons. And one of the questions they asked was, which organ is the most important? Okay, so it was just a kind of like a funny little basic question. Um, was it the brain? Was it the heart? Was it the lungs? And then the discussion developed to the point where I was like, well, they're all equally important. Um, because if you were missing any one of them, you would die. Okay, and then so I think this was actually suggested by one of the kids. Okay, and then we're waiting for Harold to respond, and it was just kind of like like because we were little kids just kind of looking for confirmation from everyone. And then Harold kind of like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and then it basically ended there. So it was almost as if it was accepted as a correct answer, that they're all equally important because if you didn't have any one of them, you would die. Okay, so and I guess I didn't really notice the hesitancy at the time, but now thinking back, the question was mostly unresolved. Okay, so there was really no answer given to which organ is the most important, and in its place we accepted the answer that they're all equally important. Okay, so today we're kind of trying to understand what priority, necessity, importance, and essential means. And maybe then we can maybe answer also which organ is the most important. You see, I mean, the thing is, um, sure, if you didn't have one of them, you would die, but you have situations where you're about to not have one of them, and you could even consider which one would you prefer to be in the situation with. I mean, if your brain was dying, you'd basically have no hope at all. But if it was only one of your kidneys, you might be able to get a transplant, or even sometimes you can get a heart transplant. So it's not as simple as just saying if you're missing them, um, you're gonna die. Okay, so let's have a look at what does it mean. So maybe just the common thing that people don't tend to understand is if something is necessary, um, it does not mean it's important. Okay, when you appreciate these kind of things, it might even change the way you structure your life. Okay, something is necessary does not mean it's important. So necessary is like, um, so I guess I haven't really explained what these are, but it is a bit of a process. So necessary is kind of like you have to do it or you die, right? Um, so for example, you need to eat, um, you need to in the long run sleep, you know, there's a whole bunch of things you need to do, like breathe. But you know, you wouldn't necessarily say, at least the eating to survive part is important. Okay. So what is important though? Okay. So you might even say it's actually something I would put in necessity is put money. Okay. So you need all these things, and so it doesn't mean that they're important, but what it does mean, and you can hear some of these quotes in sort of popular culture as well, is its absence is of importance. Okay. What is importance? Priority. So this is kind of like the things that matter. So in terms of priority, practical consequences, you do them first. Okay. So this is where you hear like first things first. Last but not least. So you know, like when we kind of, you know, in these public schools take the time to say, before we talk to all this thing, let's acknowledge the founders of the land and all this. So that this is a total misconception in what importance means. Okay, so that is not important enough to put at the start of every sentence you say. Okay, and it's actually quite disruptive to communication to do that. It might be a necessity in some sense if things have gone that way, but certainly to make it the first thing you say is an abuse of having people's attention. Okay, so yeah, so first things first. So like, because eating is only a necessity, um, like as far as the eating for survival is concerned, you wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't eat until you absolutely have to. Okay, and after all the important things have been done. So people say breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and I think that's probably also a misunderstanding of the concept of importance. So maybe I guess it's maybe of more importance than the other meals if you want to sort of view another kind of goal you might want to achieve with eating, to maybe achieve some sort of alertness or good condition throughout the day, then the breakfast might be able to contribute more to that than the other meals. Okay, so we're really starting to understand a bit more about importance. So importance, see, there's usually some quality about it. Okay, so whereas the essential, it's not really about quality. It's really about, it's almost the most no frills kind of thing possible. So for example, you have to wear like a school uniform. So you'd probably like, in terms of being just a necessity, you would spend the least possible on on a viable uniform. So it might be good to even think about getting sort of a second-hand uniform. Not going to wear it that long, and it just needs to serve its essential purpose, right? Whereas for quality, if you're looking for sort of the comfort in wearing the uniform, or to keep warm, or it fits and lets you do all the things you want to do, easy to wash and all this kind of thing, then you might consider spending a lot of money on it to get exactly what you want out of it. Okay. This actually applies to a lot of things. So like the students in our maths class. Okay, so we want to essentially think that maths is of great importance to the students, and whereas other subjects you might consider them to be just essentials. So like for example, like if you think of history as a subject worth studying, I think most people would study it in a way that makes it more of an essential thing than an important thing. So that kind of means you sort of can allocate the minimum amount of time to it. This may be similar with like some instruments, to try to get sort of, I don't know, to avoid the law of diminishing returns, to get the maximum value, to be exposed to those other subjects, and to be sort of broadly knowledgeable. Whereas for maths, I think it is of rather high importance. You want to spend sort of the bulk of your time on it. Sort of learn as much as possible. So here, this is where you shouldn't skimp on costs. I mean, the things which are of importance, your budget should actually be bigger to be able to sort of fulfill those extra needs, right? And so it doesn't make sense to have the same budget for piano as it does for maths. Okay. Yeah, so here's a big realization here. So necessary doesn't mean important, but the absence of these necessary things creates a huge issue of importance. So actually, you might find that sort of in a very general sense, I guess males are better at prioritizing. So it's like usually, or for me, I can only really focus on one thing at a time. And so if you can only do one thing at a time, it's really important you're doing the most important thing at any given time, or at least have a good concept of importance. And I've noticed that maybe females are better at managing a lot, like multitasking, of a lot of necessary things at one time, which is kind of interesting. So maybe not as good at prioritizing, but much better at juggling the pending necessities. So, like for example, just in your day-to-day life, like a lot of things, they're not that important on their own, but if you kind of let them build up, like if you don't brush your teeth for a long time, they become like serious issues. And there's almost like an infinite list of basic things in your life that kind of demand these kind of sort of like attentions. So it would definitely be a mistake to devote yourself to the necessity. So like if you, like for example, because I have to do this, so let's get all the things I have to do anyway and over and done with, and then I'll see what time I have left. But the problem with that is you'll often be like exhausted. The best of yourself has been wasted doing non-important things, and you might not be in the right condition to do the important things afterwards, and you might not even know, like it might take some time to even figure out what you have to do from then. And actually a lot of those things weren't as necessary as maybe you thought they were. Okay, so this is a very important realization about the concept of priority and necessity. I think I've heard a lot of these things mentioned in sort of popular culture. Even my friends have mentioned things, like the things which are, that they classify the tasks as like urgent, like urgent but not something. There was like the 4 classifications that essentially made them either necessities or priorities that had to or not had to be done right now. Yeah. So what about the most important organ? Well, so when you're talking about importance, yeah. So I had this. I have things from basketball as well. I used to maybe say a little bit. So I used to think transition defense was the most important, and maybe fast breaks was the most important part of basketball. Okay, and I think it certainly has some merit. For example, if you count all the points that are scored, or like the highest or the easiest points which you can get, and the highest total points that you can get, they do come from fast breaks. So in terms of the value of the score that you get, it does make them of high value. Okay, and certainly if you don't do transition defense, the number of points scored against you will have an equal countermeasure of high value against the score that you make. But what they were actually necessities. Okay, because the importance that I saw in them were only because of their absence. Okay, so basketball teams that don't have transition defense, which is a necessity, will actually see that it is a very, very important priority to actually fix that issue. Okay, whereas if you have everything, and you want to get better at a particular one, then transition defense might not be the most valuable, if that makes sense. So for example, you know, if you have a present transition defense, a present half court defense, you have a present decent fast break initiating, and a present half court offense. Which one might be the one that you choose to work on to get better? And here is where you can see sort of where importance comes in. So you might prioritize the one where you can make the sort of the biggest difference in your overall success, right? And this is a little bit to do with like necessity, because it kind of is working on what the absence of that success looks like a little bit. But so for example, if you're scoring like if you're scoring like 1 point per possession on half court offense, and if you improved everyone's shooting and improved everyone's sort of passing and just basic teamwork, you could make it to 1.3 points per possession. Okay. Whereas if you improved everyone's transition offense, so maybe the point is the transition offense score is already very high, so maybe people were scoring 1.5 on a transition offense, then having that extra 0.3 would actually almost be impossible to do, because it's almost like just doing open layups every time, and that would just mainly be them not getting back on defense. Maybe you increase your shooting, it might be more realistic, you get like 1.6 or something. So in that situation, and obviously sort of factoring in how often you were in a half-court situation and how often you were in a transition offense situation, assuming you would not sort of kind of resign to being in the half-court offense too often, then you could see that it'd be a better value proposition to go for the half-court offense to be improved. Okay, and so this is what but the problem I was seeing was a lot of teams trying to improve their half-court offense without even having transition defense. Okay, so improving your shooting and all this stuff is actually all nice and good for the long run, but it's all useless from the point of view of winning basketball games if you don't have transition defense. Okay, so I would say like that would be like the first layer of basketball: transition defense, and then transition offense. Transition offense is really just half court defense. Um, it's actually all like very connected. See, it's like it flows from transition defense, and the goal of transition defense is to get half court defense. Half court defense is to get transition offense. Okay, so that's all like a continuous. So like it naturally builds to the next thing when you succeed at the previous thing. And then once you have that, you'll crush all the teams that don't have the transition defense. Okay, or are worse at the transition offense than you. And then you can save your half court offense and stuff like that for the really good teams. Okay, anyway, enough about basketball. What about the organ? So you might value the brain as the most important organ. Okay, because you cannot even replace it. So if you were to value, and obviously it might depend on the brain itself, right? So it might relate to how rare it is to get a certain organ, how common it is to get an organ, how easy it is to get the organ. It's certainly not enough to say that the absence of the organ will result in death. Okay. Yeah, so I've touched on a lot of the topics I want to talk about. I guess it's been a bit kind of random, but if you just really think about things from this point of view, it might open your eyes to some of the leaks that you've been having in your everyday lives. Yeah. What else do people usually consider a priority, but it's only a necessity? Yeah, like filling in forms, all these kind of really meaningless tasks. They're all necessities. And sometimes they're not even necessities. Another thing, I guess, so I probably could have said this earlier for impact. And that's certainly not editing this, but so we started with a necessity not being important. I want to start with an important thing. So how does an important thing start? Important things or priorities create necessities. What does that mean? Okay, so this is maybe slightly getting a bit off topic, but important things and priorities create necessities. So like, so this is where like it's kind of more about achieving your goals. Okay, so I never try to have people, I don't tell people what goals they should want to achieve, but I do tell people once they've told me what goals they want to achieve, that whether what they do is in line with their goals. Okay, so let me give you an example. So a lot of people want to get, for example, really good at maths competitions, which is fine. Or they want to get really good at something. Okay, but to get really good at something, and that specific thing will actually give you, will almost force you to do certain things, like it'll force you to spend the time on it. It'll force you to be able to achieve certain milestones along the way. And so in some sense they create necessities. So if you want to play professional basketball, so the eating becomes a necessity, but also what you're eating and all this kind of stuff start becoming closer to necessities. And I guess if you add up all these necessities together, you start getting sort of a whole thing, which is more of like an important or a priority like thing. So maybe in a sense, is an important thing is something that's built up, like it has a lot of has quality, but it also has like a quantity associated. The quantity is sort of how many necessary things stem from it. And of course, like a ton of necessary things will also take up a ton of time. So if you measure importance in terms of how much time you spend on it, you'll almost be forced to think of something as important if it entails a lot of necessary tasks. Okay. Yeah, so some people are not really willing to do those necessary tasks. And that's also fine, but you can't be unwilling to do the unnecessary tasks and also entertain the notion that you're going to achieve those important goals that you've considered important. Okay. So and this happens all the time. I mean, people want to do something very difficult. They want to get good at maths, for example. But they want to get good at maths sort of while maintaining their social life or maintaining their all these things, which maybe they thought were necessities. Okay. But if all those things were actually necessities, then they'd be in conflict with this priority. And I think a lot of the times, a lot of those things are not necessities. And this is when I guess the word sacrifice can come in. It certainly doesn't take, so like, yeah, people will say, oh, it's necessary to have a social life, maybe, but what kind of social life is actually necessary, and what kind of social life is up to the status of important? Okay, if you have dinner once a week, maybe that's a minimalist necessary social life. But if you sort of host house parties every day, then maybe that's your calling in life. Then is to engage the social life of everyone. So managing hundreds of things because you have to, and using what time you have left to do sort of what you consider to be your main thing, and hoping that it'll work, is a formula for a deep disappointment and failure. Okay. And I've had this with a lot of people, just kind of, I know how much importance they put on certain things, and I see how little sort of time and commitment they give to those things. And I mean, I try to call it out when I can, but it's not always possible or even appropriate. But it really needs to be addressed. I mean, it's all kind of related, right? So, there's all these advances in technology, and people think they just kind of happen automatically, But a lot of the time, there's people working really hard, not even knowing that they'll succeed, right? They're giving it everything just to maximize their chance of success, and lots of them fail, but eventually a new step forward in technology happens. Okay, while everyone else, I guess maybe we fail to really appreciate sort of the sacrifice that's been done on our behalf so we can enjoy these advances in technology, and we tend to think they happen automatically. And I guess a lot of things I'm probably much more comfortable from the point of view of a ignorant spectator. Yeah. So I guess maths in education is also one of these things. I would say just a basic level of maths, and not necessarily like, formulas and stuff. It's more like just logical thinking is a necessity to have a decent life. Okay. So if it's important to you to have like this high quality life, I think maths is one of the necessities that has been created by that importance. And that necessity also becomes a very important thing on its own because it's highly likely to be absent. Okay. So just knowing sort of how few students actually achieve anywhere near an adequate level of logical thinking ability. Okay. So like there's only like out of like 60,000 students, like 3,000 do like 4 unit or extension 2 maths, and most of them can't even think logically very well. Okay. So I mean it's not just it's not really relative. Like it's not saying it's the um I'm not just saying top 5% is not good enough. It has to be top 1%. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the top 5% don't have what I consider to be sort of the basic reasoning that one needs to be able to assess things on their own without basically always looking for outside help. Okay. So if that's the case, then and out of all the sort of necessities that contribute to one's education, this one is has a high importance because it gives you a lot more than the other things in terms of value. And and it even has an even greater degree of importance as well, coming from the high likelihood that it'll be absent in your education. Okay, so I think most schools don't really understand this. Actually, a lot of schools have values in their. Actually, another thing that can be assessed in terms of priority and necessity are the values in these private schools. So yes, it's funny. So you have like, for example, commitment, integrity, um, sort of all these honor and these kind of things. So let's look at like commitment and integrity. Okay, so commitment, um, it's not really a priority, is it? It's more a necessity. But you see, if someone doesn't have commitment, then it becomes a big deal. So it becomes a priority. Um, Something like integrity. Well, that is also, I think, a necessity. I mean, I don't think there's any person of value that doesn't have integrity. And yes, if you don't have integrity, you have no value as a person, or you have very little value as a person. So not all people have equal value, that's for sure. Um, but the fact that just not having this one thing, which is actually quite a big part of all the things, will totally devalue a person, makes it a necessity, right? And and since everyone who has value has it, though the problem I guess is there's actually not very many people overall that actually have integrity. So maybe that's why it can be considered something of importance. So like if you were to choose to have necessity, integrity or commitment, you might choose integrity because it's sort of a rarer quality. But see, like they're not totally unrelated, right? Because part of integrity is kind of like fulfilling your promises, and then fulfilling your promises is kind of like a commitment to the promise in the first place. So these things are not independent of each other. And so these things are very important in the sense that if a human being is missing them in their character, then they essentially have almost no value as a person. Okay, no matter what other qualities they have. So obviously there's some sort of savants that can be managed, or micromanaged, so that those things aren't that as big a deal. But in terms of importance of education, okay, you can see that those things are not the things which can be built up on in terms of quality. Okay, integrity. So a lot of necessities. I probably should have said this earlier. It's like it's either you have it or you don't have it, right? That's kind of what a necessity is. Whereas priority is like you have to have it, but it's not just about having it. It's about sort of um the quality of how you have it. It's about maximizing it. So um yeah, so everyone needs money. So that's not even a question. But if money is important to you, then you need to maximize how much money you have. Okay. And so in terms of education, if you look at the actual value something can have, mathematics definitely comes into something of importance. Okay. Okay. It's more than just a necessity. Um, I guess an important thing, like maths. So it could be considered a necessity because if you don't have it, you're kind of stuffed. And if you do have it, like I think the more you have of it, so the more you invest in it, actually the more returns you get in your education. So I think there is a level of quality of education that directly corresponds to the quality in which you've invested in your own mathematical improvement. Okay, so here we discover that some subjects like mathematics are actually important. And when people ask like how will these ever be used in your life, it's kind of you totally miss the point. So even trying to answer that question is missing the point because like of course you're gonna use the logical thinking abilities in your life. You're not necessarily gonna use the equations, but if you were good at them, you probably would. Okay, and it takes some ingenuity to use things which you know. Yeah, it's not just have it so directly related to what you're gonna do, that you're just basically practicing it ahead of time. That's kind of ignorant. Okay, so yeah, and a lot of people learn maths like that. So there was this idea which was even popular with my mum when I was young, that you should learn the stuff you're learning in school like 2 years ahead, or at least ahead, so that when you learn it in school, you're familiar with it, and people do find it much easier to learn the second time. But this is not really educational. Like it puts too much emphasis on hard facts that are learned without necessarily the proper vetting. Okay, so maths is about thinking. Okay, so here what we try to do is we try to teach people how to think about things they've never heard of before. Not so that when they come to it, they'll be familiar with them, but when they encounter things they haven't heard of before, they'll be comfortable in trying to figure it out. Okay, and that's much more valuable educationally. So it's not a hard fact, but it's sort of it's an insight into the acquisition of facts and the relationships between facts. And if you know those things and you're able to do those things, you'll never be afraid to learn something you haven't seen before, because you're not familiar with it enough. And then you might be able to get it right away. Okay. So yeah, so I guess that's all I'm gonna say. Talk about the issue of priority and necessity and how they really impact how one manages their life. Put a lot of things in perspective. Okay, so yeah, maybe you can think about what you consider to be a priority, what you can be considered a necessity. Oh yeah, so there's a lot of things, even in recent times. I mean, the safety is a priority. See, this is a totally ridiculous notion as well. Safety is simply a necessity. If there's a risk involved, like something threatening your safety, then it does become a priority. In that, in the absence of a necessity, is a priority. Okay, but safety on its own is certainly not a priority. If it was, you wouldn't ever leave your house, right? Every time you get in a car, you're sacrificing your safety for the expedience of traveling somewhere else. Okay, so you've prioritized whatever that journey is over your safety, and but that's okay because you're still maintaining the necessary safety to have, almost certainty of survival and living a long life. Okay, so a lot of these concepts need to be understood. Yeah, I'm sure there's other examples. When I when I first thought about recording my thoughts on this, I actually probably had a lot more things to say, and now I guess just whatever comes into my head. But yeah, so this could be life-changing for you if you don't know it. If you already do know it, I mean, you can probably appreciate how sort of awesome it is. And yeah, maybe leave some comments, subscribe, and like or dislike even. It's up to you. But thank you for making it this far.